Tshomsky, the world-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author of more than 100 books. He's a laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, Tucson, and professor emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for more than half a century. Professor Tshomsky joined us last week from his home in Tucson, Arizona, where he is sheltering in place with his wife, Valeria. We spoke just after President Donald Trump foreshadowed this week's announcement that he would cut off U.S. support for the World Health Organization. This is Trump addressing reporters last week.
Is the time to freeze funding to the WHO during a pandemic?
No, maybe not. I mean, I'm not saying I'm going to do it, but we're going to look at it.
You did say that.
We give a tremendous, no, I didn't. I said we're going to look at it. We're going to investigate it. We're going to look at it.
Can you talk about what he's threatening to do right now? First, they reject the WHO tests that would have been critical, and now saying they're going to defund the World Health Organization.
Well, this is typical behavior of autocrats and dictators. When you make colossal errors, which are killing thousands of people, find somebody else to blame. And in the United States, it's unfortunately the case for well over a century and a half, that it's always easy to blame the yellow peril. They're coming after us. We've seen this all through my life, in fact, way before. So blame the World Health Organization, blame China, claim that the World Health Organization has insidious relations with China, is practically working for them. And that sells to a population that's been deeply indoctrinated for a long time, way back to the Chinese Exclusion Acts in the 19th century, to say, yeah, those yellow barbarians are coming over to destroy us. That's almost instinctive. And it's backed up by the echo chamber. So, say Rush Limbaugh, science is one of the four corners of deceit, along with media, academia, forget one of the others, but they're the four corners of deceit. They live on deceit. You keep driving that into people's heads. They say, why should we believe anything? Why should we believe the news? It's just fake news. They were all trying to destroy our savior, our president, the greatest president ever. I'm old enough to remember as a child listening to Hitler's speeches over the radio, Nuremberg rallies. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone and the reaction of the crowd, the adoring crowd, was very clear, very frightening. We know what it led to. It's hard to, it comes to mind at once when you listen to Trump's ravings in the crowd. I don't suggest that he's anything like Hitler. Hitler had an ideology, horrible ideology, not only massacring all the Jews and 30 million Slavs and the Roma and conquering much of the world, but also an internal ideology. The state, under the control of the Nazi Party, should control every aspect of life, should even control the business community. That's not the world we're in. In fact, it's almost the opposite. Business controlling the government. And as far as Trump is concerned, the only detectable ideology is pure narcissism. Me, that's the ideology. As long as I am smart enough to keep serving the real masters, pour money into the pockets of the very wealthy in the corporate sector, and they'll let you get away with your antics. It was pretty striking to see what happened at the Davos conference this January. That's the meeting of the people who are called the masters of the universe, CEOs of the major corporations, big media stars, and so on. They get together in Davos once a year, congratulate each other on how wonderful they are, put on a pose of dedicated humanists couldn't do, just totally devoted to the welfare of the people of the world. You're safe leaving your fate in our hands because we're such good guys. Trump came along and gave the keynote address. They don't like Trump. His vulgarity is incompatible with the image that they're trying to project of cultivated humanism. But they wildly applauded him, lustily applauded every word, because they know that he does recognize which pockets you have to fill with dollars and how to do it. And as long as he does that, as long as he serves his major constituency, they'll let him get away with the antics. In fact, like it, because he mobilizes a crowd that'll back policies like his legislative achievements. Main one is a tax scam that pours money into the hands of corporate coffers and harms everyone else. The deregulation is great for business. They love it. They can destroy the environment and harm people as much as they want. Very harmful to the population. You cut back on pollution constraints, on auto emission regulations. What happens? People die of pollution, of mercury poisoning. The waters are poisoned, and the world is facing disaster. You're accelerating the disaster. As I said, even in the February 10th budget, while cutting back on protection against diseases in the midst of a raging pandemic, increases funding for fossil fuel production, which is going to destroy us all. Of course, a lot more money for the Pentagon and for his famous wall. That's the world we're living in. Here, not everywhere. As I said, the Asian countries have been acting sensibly. New Zealand actually seems to have killed it. Also, Taiwan's doing very well. In Europe, Germany has maybe the lowest death rate in the world, Norway as well. There are ways to react, and there are ways to try to destroy everything. What President Trump is leading, with the support of the Murdoch echo chamber, Fox News, and others. And amazingly, this conjuring act is working. So with one hand, you raise your hand to heaven. I'm the chosen one. I'm your savior. I'm going to rebuild America, make it great again for you, because I'm the servant. I'm the loyal servant of the working class, and so on. Meanwhile, with the other hand, you're stabbing them all in the back. To carry this off is an act of political genius. You have to recognize that serious talent is involved, whether intuitive or conscious planning. It's devastating. We've seen it before. We see it now in dictators, of autocrats, sociopaths who happen to get into leadership positions. And it's now happening in the richest, most important country in world history.
So you have this situation in the United States where the economy has been brought to a standstill because of the absolute catastrophe of this pandemic, that people have to isolate, although isolation is a luxury for so many essential workers. They have to come out into this pandemic and face enormous threat to their own lives. If you can talk about whether you see this pandemic perhaps threatening global capitalism overall or shoring it up, and how the trillions of dollars that are being put into these stimulus packages are going to simply intensify inequality, or actually going to help people at the bottom.
That's a choice, not an inevitability. I mean, the corporate sector is working hard to plan for a future of the kind that you're describing. The question is whether popular organizations will be able to impose enough pressure to make sure that this doesn't happen. And there are ways. Take the corporate, what you just described. The corporations right now are hiding their copies of Ayn Rand and rushing to the nanny state and asking for for benefits from the public to overcome the results of their criminal behavior. What have they been doing for the last years? Profits have been going sky high. They've been indulging in an orgy of stock buybacks, which are devices to increase the wealth for the rich shareholders and for management, while undermining the productive capacity of the enterprise at a huge scale, setting their offices somewhere in a little room in Ireland so they don't have to pay taxes using tax havens. This is not small change. This is tens of trillions of dollars robbing the taxpayer. Does that have to be the case? Take the current giveaway to corporations. It should be accompanied by conditionalities, term we're familiar with from the IMF. They should be required to ensure that there will be no more use of tax havens. There will be no more stock buybacks, period. If they don't do that, with a firm guarantee, no money from the public. Is that utopian? Not at all. That was the law, and the law was enforced up until Ronald Reagan, who turned on the spigot, said, rob as much as you like, with Milton Friedman and other luminaries in the background telling him that's liberty. Liberty means rob the public massively by things like tax havens and stock buybacks. So there's nothing utopian about these conditions. It says let's go back to a period of pretty much regimented capitalism, which developed since Roosevelt was carried through till the 70s when it began to erode and with Reagan just ended. There should be further conditionalities. Should be working people, should be placed, the part of management should be representatives of workers. Is that impossible? No, it's done in other countries. Germany, for example. There should be a requirement that they guarantee a living wage, not just minimum wage, a living wage. That's a conditionality can be imposed. And we can move further and recognize, notice that all of this is pre-Trump. Trump is taking a failing, lethal system and turning it into a monstrosity. But the roots were before him. Just think back to the reason why the pandemic occurred in the first place. Drug companies are following capitalist logic. They don't want to do anything. The neoliberal hammer says the government can't do anything the way it did in the past. You're caught in a vice. Then comes along Trump and makes it incomparably worse. But the roots of the crisis are pre-Trump. Same with the healthcare system. Like we know that everyone should know the basic facts. It's an international scandal. Twice the costs of comparable countries, some of the worst outcomes. The costs were recently estimated by a study in The Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals. They estimated that the annual cost to Americans are close to $500 billion and 68,000 lives lost. That's not so small.
World-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author Noam Chomsky. When we come back, he'll discuss conditions in Gaza during the pandemic and the rise of authoritarianism around the world and the progressive response. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we return to part two of our conversation with Noam Chomsky, world-renowned linguist, political dissident, and author, I asked him about Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on Earth where at least 13 cases of COVID-19 have been reported. The World Health Organization reports there are just 87 ventilators for Gaza's 2 million residents. Nearly 300 cases and 2 deaths have been confirmed in the West Bank. This is Professor Chomsky. If you can talk for a moment globally about what's happening on an issue that has been close to your heart for decades, and that is the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank. What it means for a place like Gaza, called by the UN and people around the world a kind of open-air prison of almost 2 million people, what the pandemic could mean there.
It's almost impossible to think about. Gaza is 2 million people who are living in a prison, open-air prison, under constant attack. Israel, which is the occupying power, recognized by everyone in the world except Israel, Israel has been imposing very harsh sanctions ever since the Palestinians made the mistake of carrying out the first free election in the Arab world and electing the wrong people. The United States and Israel came down on them like a ton of bricks. Israel's policy, as was explained by Dov Weissglass, the person in charge of the withdrawal of Israeli troops, withdrawal of the settlers, and imposition of the new regime, explained frankly, we are putting the people of Gaza on a diet, just enough to keep them alive, meaning wouldn't look good if they all die, but not anything more than that. So not a piece of chocolate or a toy for a child. That's out. Just enough to stay alive. If you have a serious health problem, maybe you can apply to go to the hospital in East Jerusalem. Maybe after a couple of weeks you'll be allowed to go. Maybe a child is allowed to go, but his mother's not allowed to come. When there are now a couple of cases in Gaza, if that extends, it's a total disaster. International institutions have pointed out that by 2020, that's now, Gaza will probably become barely livable. About 95% of the water's totally polluted, place is a disaster. And Trump has made sure that it'll get worse. He withdrew funding from the support systems for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. UNRWA killed the funding. Palestinian hospitals killed the funding. And he had a reason. They weren't praising him enough. They weren't respectful of the God. So therefore we'll strangle them, even when they're barely surviving under a harsh and brutal regime. Incidentally, this extends to the Palestinians in Israel as well. Human rights activists in Israel pointed out recently, there's articles about it in Haaretz, that Israel finally began to set up a few drive-by testing areas, only in Jewish areas, not in the areas with Palestinian population, and to make sure that the intended results would follow. They announced it only in Hebrew, not in Arabic, so Palestinians wouldn't even know. Well, that's within Israel. In the occupied territories, far worse. And the Trump hammer came in saying, we're not even going to give you a penny because you're not respectful enough of me. I don't know how to describe this kind of thing. I can't find words for it.
Noam Chomsky, what do you think is required in an international response to stop the rise of authoritarianism in response to this pandemic? For example, in the Philippines, where the authoritarian leader, Trump ally Duterte, talks about killing people. The massive crackdown without support of the people of India, 1.3 billion people with Narendra Modi. President Trump was in India as the pandemic was taking off, never saying a word about it, packing a stadium of 100,000 people. You have Orban in Hungary, who is now ruling by decree. What would it take to turn that around to be a progressive response?
Well, actually, what's happening, to the extent that you can find some coherent policy in the madness in the White House, one thing does emerge with considerable clarity, namely an effort to construct an international of the most reactionary states and oppressive states, led by the gangster in the White House. Now, this is taking shape. Can run through it, but since you mentioned India, Modi, who is a Hindu nationalist extremist, is systematically moving to destroy Indian secular democracy and to crush the Muslim population. What's happening in Kashmir is horrifying. It was bad enough before, now getting much worse. Same with the Muslim population, a huge population in India. The current lockdown is you can almost describe it as genocidal. Modi gave, I think, a 4-hour warning saying total lockdown. That's over 1 billion people. Some of them have nowhere to go. People in the informal economy, which is a huge number of people, are just cast out. Go walk back to your village, which may be 1,000 miles away. Die on the roadside. This is a huge catastrophe in the making. Right on top of the strong efforts to impose the ultra-right Hindutva doctrines that are at the core of Modi's thinking and background. What's happening, and quite apart from this, India, in fact, South Asia generally, is going to become unlivable pretty soon if current climate policies persist. Last summer, the temperature in Rajasthan went up to 50 degrees centigrade, and it's increasing. Hundreds of millions of people in India that don't have access to water. It's going to get much worse. Could lead to a nuclear war between the two powers that basically rely on the same water resources, which are declining under global warming, Pakistan and India. I mean, the horror story that's developing is, again, indescribable. You can't find words for it. And some people are cheering about it, like Donald Trump and his friend Bolsonaro in Brazil, a couple of other sociopaths. But how do you counter a reactionary international? By developing a progressive international. And there are steps to that. They don't get much publicity. But I think it's this coming December, there'll be a formal announcement of what has been in process for some time. Yanis Varoufakis, the founder and leading figure in GEM25, the progressive movement in Europe, very important. Varoufakis and Bernie Sanders came out with a declaration calling for a progressive international to combat and we hope overcome the reactionary international based in the White House. Now, if you look at the level of states, this looks like an extremely unequal competition. But states are not the only things that exist. If you look at the level of people, it's not impossible. It's possible to construct a progressive international based on people, ranging from the organized political groups that have been proliferating, that have gotten a huge shot in the arm from the Sanders campaign, ranging from them to self-help, mutual aid, self-help organizations that are arising in communities all over the world, in most impoverished areas of Brazil, for example. And even this astonishing fact that I mentioned, that the murderous crime gangs are taking responsibility for bringing some form of decent protection against the pandemic in the favelas, the miserable slums in Rio. All of this is happening on the popular level. If it expands and develops, if people don't just give up in despair, but work to change the world as they've done in the past under much worse conditions, if they do that, there's a chance for a progressive international. And notice, bear in mind that there are also striking cases of internationalism, progressive internationalism at the state level. So take a look at the European Union. The rich countries in Europe, like Germany, have recently given us a lesson in just what the union means, right? Germany's managing pretty well. They probably have the lowest death rate in the world. It's an organized society. Right next door, northern Italy, is suffering miserably. Is Germany giving them any aid? No. In fact, Germany even blocked the effort to develop Eurobonds, general bonds in Europe, which could be used to alleviate the suffering in the countries under the worst conditions. But fortunately for Italy, it can look across the Atlantic for aid from the superpower on the Western Hemisphere, Cuba. Cuba is once again, as before, exhibiting extraordinary internationalism, sending doctors to Italy. Germany won't do it, but Cuba can. China is providing material aid. So these are steps towards progressive internationalism at the state level.
World-renowned political dissident, linguist, and author Noam Chomsky, laureate professor in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Arizona, Tucson, professor emeritus at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for more than half a century. Noam Chomsky joined us last week from his home in Tucson, Arizona, where he's sheltering in place with his wife, Valeria. Go to our website at Democracy Now! To see part 1 of our conversation. When we